America, there are two main areas to consider. One is the expectation that they will prepare food for their husbands and their children. This was and is for many seen as a kind of sacred role. There is no higher calling for women. But also there's the duty of women to be skinny. We need to remain attractive to our husbands. We can't help but be unfaithful if we lose the weight we've naturally gained, aging, or the constant state of pregnancy that some conservatives and attractive means slim. In short, traditional women must provide food, but also abstain from it. And traditional womanhood, that's a hallmark of right-wing America, particularly within the far right. So let's start with the second point. Women's duty to maintain a specific kind of body, one that is attractive to our husband, especially. Academia can tell you a lot about a topic, but sometimes you need to go to first-hand sources. So I decided to dive into conservative women's magazine, Evie, which wanted a deep understanding of conservative femininity and food through their health section. It was, honestly, a lot of what I'd expected. Evie articles about weight consistently reinforce popular fat-phobic misconceptions, like fat people are delusional about their weight, that insisting on just the existence of fat phobia is pseudoscientific and a delusional state of mind, whereas skinny shaming is both real and very harmful. The body positivity movement is cringeworthy because it forces women to objectify themselves and display their gross, uncovered bodies. But when Evie has a photo shoot of a skinny woman in a bikini, that's empowering. So the website and magazine is set up like a classic glossy mag that we're probably all familiar with. But Evie specifically pairs the generic sections health, beauty, and relationships with right on talking points like the importance of women becoming mothers. Seriously, so much of this website is about how you should get off your birth control. Also, just to sprinkle it in there, I had a phrenology article because apparently we're back in our racist, skull-shaped pseudoscience era. Evie exemplifies the right's obsession with thin white women. In the Open Democracy article, How the Far Right is Using Thinness to Radicalize Women and Teen Girls, Lois Shearing writes, for far-right women, there is no such thing as body positivity or body neutrality. Thinness is a moral imperative. It shows dominance over the body and aligns oneself with European beauty standards. But that's not how Evie directly advertises thinness. And I think that's important to remember. These articles aren't outright saying the thing. While they do emphasize self-discipline and issues associated with thinness, I mean, things about how their articles imply or even outright say that people and advocates are morally wrong. The main point that they seem to make is that skinny is achieving your full potential. And so, women raised in a house giving other people gets bored of being able to lead a grown-up life in person. It talks about kissing and affection. The political side of it can slip in between the cracks. In an interview with Shearing, Hazel Woodrow, a researcher at Anti-Hate Canada, explained the logic behind this tactic. If I was trying to radicalise a young girl, I would incite an argument, because your capacity for critical thought is used out of starvation, and it would be easy to introduce a racialized aspect. Let's look at an example from the source itself. A few quotes from an article in Envy by Jamie Marshall entitled, I'm happier when I'm skinny. The fat acceptance movement is not one born out of compassion, but demoralization. It's a movement centered above all else on giving up, giving into your baseline, hedonistic desires, rather than demanding more of yourself so you can reach self-actualization. Beauty is incredibly important. It's what inspires us to achieve greatness. It moves people to realize profundity, even seeing something divine in a captivating work of art. That's why I ensure that any movement whose objective is to make it. And what about the process of self-improvement? The prospect of having a higher goal to work towards is an essential aspect of self-actualization. Why shouldn't we demand the best of ourselves? This girl boss type language is so pointed from an outside perspective, because Evie also seems to actively discourage women from building careers. In a way, the focus on food and bodies is a way to deal with deferred female ambition. Your body and your family is your only project worth pursuing. Put all that drive and energy that other women are spending on the wrong kinds of self-empowerment into constantly criticizing yourself in order to keep clinging to the mission of self-improvement. As one of their Instagram posts claims, being a mother is a successful career choice. There's nothing demeaning about devoting your life to your children and your home. You can see this focus on a kind of liberal boogeyman, an imagined persecutor of conservative souls, someone who's somehow forbidding you from being able to unapologetically aspire to be in shape, a kind of absurd idea of a fat left-wing activist yelling at you for going to your home gym and loving your kids, I guess. Evie's food content isn't harmless. They promote eating only 1,200 calories a day, back-to-back dieting, constantly being on the lookout for bad food, dedicating a significant portion of your brain power to obsessing over food. This all feeds in the first point that I made in this section, the idea that right-wing women's role centers around cooking and feeding her husband and children. My American friend that I mentioned earlier broke down the dynamic of a family in the South for me. The women of the family were taught to cook from an early age. At family gatherings, women were expected to all be in the kitchen. Men's connection to food is through one specific sector, the grill. Men do the meat, women do the sides. Not just at big gatherings, but everyday meals too. Women make the food, set the table and serve it. And then they watch for the men to begin eating before they do. And when they do eat, it's different portions. As she explained, women cook, they don't eat. Even those women growing up who are allowed to take part in the enjoyment of cooking are still expected to do so in a way that never compromises their looks. By that, it meant while talking to Mara, she brought up the mistaken idea that cults and organizations and beliefs have to have a human cult leader. Instead, he suggested extreme diet movements create internal cult leaders, a kind of panopticon of self, where the voice controlling you comes from within, yet is still ultimately out of your control in many ways. Within this framework, there's a subsection of right-wing women who become particularly susceptible to this, ones whose very sense of self and purpose is tied to the labor they do for others, being a good wife and a perfect mother, a desire for a perfection of self, but a perfection of self for the good of others, looking good for your husband, choosing the best food for your family, making the best care of your family. And that internal cult leader is enforced by the wider cultural beliefs of the community you're in.
And admit you're in danger.
Who are you talking to right now?
To also think about paths to dehumanizing, including practical ideas for women financially trapped in these far-right communities. But it's important also to challenge the cultural archetype of the pure white woman, framing all of these women as helpless victims of right-wing brainwashing, suffering under the yokes of their husbands, and innocent victim needing to be saved. To fall for this fragile image of whiteness and womanhood is to feed into the very harmful racial dynamics the alt-right perpetuates. Beliefs which have grown increasingly more mainstream through the rise of women as far-right influencers. There's this breakdown of successful content on the internet that you'll often see, that if you want to build a solid career, you need to either inform, entertain, or inspire with what you make. The far-right has honed in on their strategy that works. How-to videos, tutorials, and inspiration content, combined with an aspirational aesthetic to pull viewers in. They use these three pillars of content to lead to an ultimate goal of convincing people. Far from the over-the-top alt-right kind of bro podcast, this content made by women is often more insidious. Smiling white women with organic cotton prairie dresses showing you how to make jam. You can scroll through a bunch of her videos, see the bright-eyed gaggle of kids helping her decorate Christmas cookies, then a what I wear on a date night with my husband carousel of images, and then a recipe for natural service cleanup for your kitchen, and think, even subconsciously, that this is the kind of simple, calm, happy life that we probably love. Give it a follow, knowing that more of her recipes will appear with each bowl, probably knowing you'll save them and never actually get around to making them. But small things begin to creep around the edges of the videos. The mention of a Bible quotation you don't recognise, your husband, which, if you look it up, is talking about the importance of women being subservient to men. Or maybe she's reposted a video from a biased news source into your feed, talking about a violent crime that this source emphasizes was the work of immigrants. You might not even notice it's on your feed because she's the one who reposted it. The implications within her videos about her kids, talking about why she's choosing to homeschool them, the types of things that they're being taught in these mainstream schools she just doesn't agree with, you know, the danger that they're exposed to, without specifying what exactly it is, the implication that this is what you do if you're a good mother who cares about her kids. This isn't an overtly political account, this isn't a right-wing news source. It's just a woman sharing her perfect life, her life of chores and childcare and organic healthy recipes, with a kind of, you know, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed view of women who don't think their family is important enough to do the same. The YouTuber Blonde Buffalo has a series of videos sharing organic recipes from nut milk and berry preserving, along with messaging about white European. Again, a dog-eating topic for the far right. Many of these women are what has been termed traditionalists, women with traditional values, many of whom see feminism as a dogmatic and extreme movement that demonizes their choice to focus on child-rearing and homemaking.
People on this app act like this is the worst thing in the world. Stay-at-home mum, my husband's at work providing for our family. I have some sourdough fermenting on the bench, a baby, an apron, a cute dress.
Yet, this surface understanding ignores the many feminists whose life and passion lies in family life. It's a mistake to categorize all women making content about their home lives, cooking for their families, or having cleaning tips as the same as those seeping far-right rhetoric into their content.
I love abortion and trans people and migrants and birth control and immigrants and gay people and having fun and just being nice and a good person.
Indeed, this equating of the two is exactly what lets so many of these accounts fly under the radar. Because while ideas of cultural heritage, community knowledge sharing, and the respect for tradition can be engaged with by anyone for any reason, they're all ideas which have been used as dog whistles by the far right. Cultural heritage becomes white supremacy, respect for tradition becomes enforced gender roles, community knowledge sharing. Women of all organizations say adopt the Bibles to one another about food, food is Kathleen Lee describes white supremacist recruitment among women taking place through mundane activities like grocery shopping and community picnics, or during discussions about the threats from chemicals that could poison their children's food and water, which should segue into talk of other noxious influences, such as ideological or racial ones. The danger is in the mobilization of far-right women into women's spaces, talking about women's issues in service of far-right goals. Women who might be put off by the violent misogyny of the alt-right are not as immediately put off by this seeming innocence of a social media influencer. This isn't some out-of-touch grandma ranting about the good old days. These are women packaging their beliefs as a kind of counterculture to the stresses of a chaotic and uncertain modern life, and eventually to the angry, miserable feminists who seem intent on empowering you to be trapped within it. Because it's not purely political in the way that overt propaganda is. You don't have to be searching for this type of content for it to find you, and it's especially likely to appeal to people who are seeking knowledge. In other words, people who don't necessarily have existing context with which to create a balanced view. Your kid is struggling in local primary school, for example, so you search how to start homeschooling, and then far-right trad wife adjacent content will find you. It's an algorithmic pipeline that the far right has been taking advantage of for years. The second author I interviewed as research for this video is Kendall Vanderslice, a food and theology scholar who actually works as a baker, running workshops that combine baking bread and worship. She found the surface level similarities of her work and the aesthetics of many of these far-right accounts reveals the dangerous potential in this algorithmic pipeline.
This is largely now an aesthetic movement of what's taking over, because I think there's different sort of underlying motivation behind that different content, but I think consumers of that content many do not notice the nuances of that, and I don't even think the algorithm necessarily notices the nuances of that. And so what people then get fed, like maybe someone at first notices some of those nuances, but then the more they're in it, they're sort of inoculated to them. And then it becomes sort of increasingly more far right the longer that they engage with the content. So I experienced this quite dramatically over the last couple of years. Like my main job is that I teach workshops on how to bake bread as a spiritual practice. I teach them in churches and retreat centers and colleges. And when I first started, like prior to 2020, there was not a ton of there was no Christian bread making content on social media. I was sort of the weird person who was like, I think we can find a lot of joy in making bread. And then you have 2020, sort of sourdough takes off, and then 2022 is really when sort of the conservative Christian far right version of sourdough being this lead into government conspiracy sort of trajectory takes off. I found that I suddenly was getting a lot of followers that were sort of deeply far right, and if I said anything political, then I just got inundated with emails and messages that I never would have gotten before, because there was just sort of this assumption of well, you're a Christian, you bake bread, therefore you must be in this world.
And then what is not acknowledged by these far-right influencers is that what they're doing itself is work. The vision of life that they curate on their accounts, where all they do is cooking, perfect meals, lightly cleaning an already spotless house, that's only part of the story. Their baby is still sicking up, their toddlers are still throwing food on the floor, their husband's still leaving skid marks in their underwear they're washing off camera. It isn't all idyllic perfection. But even if it was, the thing that would allow it to be that way is the helping hand of money. Money generated by the videos themselves. Even discounting their husband's income, the ad revenue and brand deals on daily videos with hundreds and thousands of views is a part of of that lifestyle. These women often encourage their female viewers not to earn money through traditional work, to focus on their family instead, while gaining financial stability themselves in the process with those very videos. Money that can be used to buy the organic food and seasonal decorations that feature in the videos as a kind of moral imperative to the viewers. Even for those who could buy ample raw ingredients, there's the fact that prepping and cooking every dish is a full-time job. Just ask any early 1900s housewife. It was in part the influx of commercial canned foods and packaged meals amidst the post-World War II economic boom that liberated women to pursue paid work. To suggest that these kinds of convenience foods are inherently bad is to take issue with the working woman. She can't devote as much time and energy to food prep, so she feeds her family more processed items, ostensibly worsening their diet and increasing their risk for the chronic diseases that now plague this country. The message? If we just went back to a simpler time, when women knew their proper role at home, we'd have purer food, and in turn, better health. And if you do give your kid frozen chicken nuggets for dinner, well, basically poison. And for many women, there's nothing more motivating than shame. A shame which can be found in the most personal and influential of places.
I am Dumbledore, Lord Voldemort.
Professor Snape.
Food and Christianity. Christianity is a key pillar of American conservatism, which underlies a lot of the ideas that we've talked about so far, from political morality to the gender binary. As I mentioned at the start, this video didn't start out being about the far right. It actually started out because my co-writer Isabel stumbled across the phenomenon of Christian diet books.
What would Jesus eat? If your answer is bread and wine, you are correct.
And so within a list of video essay ideas that he sent me last month, number 8 simply read American Christianity and diet culture. I was intrigued. Normally the things that grab me are stuff that I've already been thinking about. But although I've made a few videos about diet culture, I never thought about the role religion played. So naturally, I replied, I need to know your take for option A. She explained her thinking behind the suggestion, and I was more interested. And so we actually started this video within Christian diet spaces specifically. Now it's important to note here that fasting, religious diets and food restriction are all legitimate ways to practice faith. All Abrahamic religions, for example, call for their followers to either avoid certain foods or to restrict the intake of food during certain periods of time, like Ramadan, Lent or Yom Kippur, for example. Some might keep kosher or halal or follow elements of Mosaic law. Some might abstain from alcohol. Certain Christian monks follow vegetarian diets, and that's not to mention religions outside of these three. Like, these relationships to food can be deeply meaningful. They can represent tradition, a way to feel closer to your community, your ancestors, your God. It can be a way to increase gratitude, to remind you not to take certain comforts for granted. It can be paired with acts of charity. And even if you don't follow any individual religion, you might still participate in food restriction for spiritual or ethical reasons. Maybe you don't buy brands that you consider to be unethical. Maybe you don't eat meat. Maybe you choose to only eat local seasonal produce. I say all of that to make it clear that the Christian diets that we found are not any of that. They're books and plans which co-opt deep religious convictions so they can sell believers what's normally a fad diet, but is occasionally a dangerous one. This kind of content is not new. The 1957 book Pray Your Weight Away by Charles Shedd was a Christian weight loss book that claimed obesity was tied to sinfulness, which is essentially the foundation of the Christian weight loss movement. This harmful sentiment is echoed in the dozens of following Christian diet books, with titles like More of Me, Less of Jesus, Slim for Him, The Devil Wants Me Fat, Full, Food Jesus and the Battle for Satisfaction, What Would Jesus Eat, and so many more. So coming back to talk about these books while filming this, after speaking to Kendall, is so depressing, because Kendall's work is like a really genuinely interesting, community-based, connected way of thinking about the presence of food within biblical texts and its relationship with God and with each other, with communities, individual spiritual practice, in a way that is not then tied to selling people the idea that they are fundamentally broken, that they look wrong, that what they're putting in their bodies is wrong. And it just is such a stark contrast between the ways in which food can be used in a positive way to do with faith and spirituality and community, and then this other way. Now, some of these books in this genre, like What Would Jesus Eat, they kind of just are like knockoff Mediterranean diets that emphasize getting rid of processed foods and red meat, interspersed with motivational pieces of scripture. But then there are ones like the Daniel Plan. So the New York Times actually pulled a bunch of choice quotes from this plan in an article that they did on this genre, including these ones. God isn't going to evaluate you on the basis of the bodies he gave to other people, but he will judge what you did with what you have been given. Satan does not want you living a healthy life because that honors God. Why should God heal you of an obesity-related illness if you have no intention of changing the choices that led to it? Once again, fatness and sustainability is not a non-negative state. It represents the state of manifestation of sloth, gluttony, and greed. The devil wants you to be fat. So if you lose weight, you're defeating the devil. Why are you defeating the devil? Like, do you not understand that your body belongs to God? Why are you wasting the most precious gift he ever gave you? Stop defying God's plan. It adds religious guilt onto the body-shaming dumpster fire that already has so many people in a church, and it's being sold for profit. Oral Roberts University, a Christian university in Oklahoma that makes its students sign a contract promising that they won't engage in occult practices of homosexuality, ran a mandatory weight loss program for its students in the 70s called POPS, for the pounds of. In POPS, any student at the university let me say that again. The university expelled students one article covering the program at the time wrote that since the program began, 4 students have been suspended for failing to reduce. One student who was ordered to reduce from 250 to 260 pounds and lost only 10 said he maintained a 3.7 grade point average but received one letter after another, always threatening suspension. He left the university after receiving a letter last summer telling him that before you will be able to complete registration with school, you must report for a weight check. To be readmitted, your weight must be at or below 128 pounds. The school asked this student to lose 50 pounds and then expelled him for not losing weight fast enough. Fat students also had to attend special lectures where teachers would use scripture to demean them. For example, one lecturer said, you know, in the book of Romans, Paul says that all 228 is the verse in case you want to look it up. All things work together for good to those that love God, who are called according to his purpose. Now, my goodness, how can anything like that be good? And how can God have purpose in a person being fat? It was so bad that fat students had to partner with the ACLU to file a complaint with the Department for Health, Education and Welfare. But Rowan, this was the 1970s. Everyone was crazy back then. The grapefruit diet was a thing that people thought was common sense. Well, in 2016, Oral Roberts University required its students to wear fitness trackers and graded them on their step count. Fitness at Oral Roberts University, it's not really about health. It's about supposed piety. A former provost at the university, Carl Hamilton, said, "Our body is the home of the Holy Spirit. Making that home a fit one is one of the ways to glorify God and the Holy Spirit." Do you see how this echoes the failed potential sentiment in those toxic articles from EV magazine? Both of these spaces constantly tell fat people that their fatness means that they are failing some higher purpose, that their fatness stands in the way of them fulfilling some sort of like self-fulfillment and God's prophecy. There is this kind of seemingly religious fueled fat-phobic diet culture in evangelical spaces in particular. And it's easy to see how an initial interest in a diet book which seems to take your faith into account might lead to discovering these more extreme far-right ideas that are then tied to it. Instead of using food as a way to be closer to God or your religious community, these diet plans and body-shaming courses become products that religion helps sell. It's a stark example of how religious language and even spiritual experiences can be co-opted for other purposes. One of the most infamous examples of this was the Remnant Fellowship Christian diet, which is plagued with accusations of functionally being a cult that promoted child abuse and used religion to enrich its leader, Gwen Shamlin. The organisation told members that fat was sin manifest and that they could help them, particularly women, reach their weight loss goals through praying their way through hunger. In one interview, Shamblin outlined her philosophy, how to stop bowing down to the refrigerator and how to bow back down to him. An article from The Guardian in 2021 explains the findings of a documentary series about Shamblin and her organisation. As The Way Down illustrates, over 3 increasingly ominous episodes, Shamblin exerted more and more power over members' finances, marriages, custody arrangements, parenting, social media, and eventually all contact with the outside world. Testimonies from ex-members and those threatened with the loss of family members to the insular group, which believes it is the only path to heaven, demonstrate how Remnant was actually about power and controlling people's lives, controlling their weight, controlling their marriages, controlling their finances. And this diet program was popular with evangelical women for more than just the connection to supposed scripture. It also promised something many women were desperately craving, a framework for weight loss that felt meaningful, infused with the righteousness and familiarity of religion, a community and common purpose beyond the home. It was the promise of power, being the right to hearing people saw that a good Christian man would find vulnerable. The diet itself was nothing new. The usage of God and the power and pressure that comes with that for evangelical women in particular had the power to exert a kind of control that made Champion rich. Thinness is not some universal Christian belief. Jesus' biggest hits kind of included feeding a lot of people. The New Testament has this lovely piece of advice, actually, from Romans, ironically. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And perhaps, even more sassily, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? What good is it, huh? Typically, Christians celebrate Easter and Christmas with a feast, and yet this cultural message of food purity and faith so often seems to want to counter this. So one of my patrons explained, food was often mentioned in sermons, and it was usually discussed as either something you could do for the community to lead people to Christ, but there were other times when it was brought up in a more your body is a temple way. These sermons would focus on how you should eat healthy things and avoid alcohol because the denomination, Church of God Pentecostal, I was in, focused a lot on how you could be filled with the Holy Spirit and you would be more likely to receive the Holy Spirit to do those things. Paradoxically, there was usually a potluck full of well unhealthy food as substitute tends not to be the healthiest afterwards. So in the case of my patron, they're put in a paradoxical situation. In order to be admired in the community, you need to avoid unhealthy foods, but to participate in the community, you need to consume most of the unhealthy foods too. Because this isn't a purely religious phenomenon, it's cultural and political too. There are wider implications of our food and bodies that intersect with religious ideas. Take muscular Christianity, for example, a movement popularized in the US in the 19th century. That might sound familiar to examples from that section earlier about food and masculinity. Getting swole for Jesus, if you're a violinist, claiming that sports and athleticism was a manly way to practice Christianity. The rise of the movement in the US has been tied specifically to a kind of traditionalist anxiety around the place of white men in America during the emergence of the social changes like the women's rights movement and increased immigration to the US at the time. In contrast, empowerment for evangelical women, it's not about building strength through muscle, but a kind of gentle, ineffable strength of motherhood. Some ultra-conservative Christian communities see this as a quest that is equally tied to increasing the number of children in a family as it is for caring for those children.
Somehow, staying in and taking care of those kids and creating this home is somehow not empowering. But ask anyone who's ever had one child, never mind six, how relaxing, how relaxing. I mean, I'm thinking there's this whole idea of quiver fall, right? What if you have one kid to have a quiver fall, right? Because you're creating, soldiers in the army and all of that sort of thing. And so the idea that you're raising all of those kids, is a tremendous amount, but is being sold under this idea of the bad wife, that it's somehow really easy.
Ultimately, biblical Christian values around food, ideas of feeding the needy, for example, can become warped from right-wing rhetoric that suggests that some people are needy due to their own faults. If their actions and sins even are the reason that they're needy, and that's God's will, right? And so, many far-right models of Christianity become incompatible with working-class food security, meaningful acts of charity, or food and sex. Right-wing American activists of class are honestly fascinating. On the one hand, there are these clear examples of rampant classism within Muslim policies and rhetoric, but then they're simultaneously using working class archetypes to appeal to a certain working class demographic, essentially separating them out into the right and wrong kind of good American. So on the one hand, you have the good poor, the salt of the earth, the deserving. These are, unsurprisingly, often working class white men. It's a demographic that the far right can target by leaning into this good bad divide, and food is a key part of that divide. In this context, meat, for example, isn't just about masculinity. It's a symbol for the American everyman, a meat and potatoes kind of guy who's down to earth. And vegans in this narrative become middle-class elites who are out of touch with what working people need. Vegan food is characterized as fancy and fussy, and the descriptions of the food go on to reflect those eating it. Your food habits become a show of political morality removed from the food itself. Think about the EV articles deriding anyone pointing out even the existence of fatphobia. Overweight left-wingers become evidence of excessive liberalism, a political class of self-indulgent decadence, sinful and uncontrolled, looking for lazy handouts. The way that manifests in singular bodies is then projected onto entire political movements. Think about these people want to spend your hard-earned money on themselves and do socialism. Ultimately, any food or eating habit can be politicized because it's just kind of mostly symbolic, right? Like there's nothing inherently about any particular fancy about food in and of itself. I mean, beans on toast is see and witness. Those were government handouts, which were seen as different. Another of my patrons had a similar experience. My family was absolutely poor enough to be on food stamps, but my parents never participated in the program. As a poor family, we received help from the community all the time. We never accepted the government's help. My mum in particular looks down on people who accept handouts, even though she herself is needing help quite often. It isn't that political parties are split class, it's that class struggles are used to reinforce other influences and prejudices like racism and racism. Instead of seeing the similarities and thinking that white people in conservative communities are encouraged to see the source of aid as a dividing difference. This cognitive dissonance allows for a clear chain of blame between everyday identities and other poor people. The other poor people are those outside the homogenized white Christian community. The lack of geographical and cultural connection means bad poor people are a kind of imagined hypothetical humanity. Stories of food stamps being used for wrong things combines with the existing racial stereotypes to create the welfare queen stereotype, for example. And so this kind of chain of logic kicks in. People abuse and scrounge off government handouts. Government handouts are an urban luxury. Urban areas are black areas. White people are scrounging off our community's hard-earned money. The dominoes fall, and the finger is white supremacy. One of my patrons explained how their family members, who would talk a lot about how opposed they were to how easy getting food stamps and handouts was, having these discussions based on conversations rather than knowledge. Ironically, once I moved out and was on my own, I was told at one point by my mum that I should apply for food stamps because I didn't make a lot and would take advantage of it. I had to explain to her that I didn't qualify just because I was in a low income bracket, and she was genuinely surprised to hear the actual eligibility. In fact, I think a lot of people are surprised by this amount. Today, a consumer needs $132 to buy what $100 bought in 2019. Dry groceries and meat are 4% more than they did in 2019. While high-income households can afford fresh, healthful food and the foods covering medicine, households that suffer from food insecurity cannot. This group includes children, people of colour, and people whose income is low, but not low enough to qualify for the federal supplemental nutrition assistance. Fact 1.
So glad I brought this skin along.
Live like this. I don't know, Linus. I don't have time to research upgrades for this thing. Can't you just build me one? Do I look?
1/3 of people who face hunger do not qualify for SNAP. There are, I think, some white people whose only experience of structural oppression is financial, who are also deeply invested in the ideology of the American dream. What this means in practice is that they become incapable of seeing the systemic elements of class, but instead choose to view financial struggles as a personal shortcoming, or even momentary bad luck. In doing so, they're able to distance themselves from other poor or working class people who are black or Muslim or queer or disabled or all of the above, instead of engaging with class solidarity. Indeed, because they see class as an easily changeable state if only you work hard enough, those marginalized by other forms of oppression as well, or who are unable to affect poverty, become proof of that marginalized group's inherent failings. And meanwhile, this type of poor white person is able to buy into tax cuts for the rich, or the upholding of the 1% as role models, or even the belief in a white nationalist state, because they are only a few more work shifts and a great business idea away from being rich and benefiting from that vision of progress. But it isn't just white people whose only experience of structural oppression is financial who fall into this trap. White women who suffer from sexism can make a similar internal bargain, but rather than in the workforce, their labour in weight of being granted individual power is deterring to traditional white womanhood itself. If the poor white man is told to play the game of capitalism to succeed, the poor white woman is told to play the game of gender. I think we can see this divisive and racialized class warfare evident in those parts of the far-right movement who are embracing welfare precisely for their end goal of creating a white Christian American ethno-state. I spoke to Kendall about the parts of the far-right who see their own use of current welfare systems as almost a means to an end.
So there are some pockets that are sort of this idea of like we have as many children as possible, and then through that we like raise up our army of Christians that can like, you know, do things politically related to and within that community, it's very important that the woman stays home and is like having children as much as possible through the entirety of her childbearing years. And for the most part, there is a lot of comfort taking government into assistance for food because it's the only way that the system works.
I think it's a kind of audacious entitlement that weaves its way into these practices and acts as moral reassurance that any feats of logic or seemingly contradictory actions are justified because the end goal is what's important. The utopian imagery of a nice white America with picket fences and apple pies from people who give interviews about how they just want the best for their kind. But it's not racist or transphobic or ableist to want those people to go elsewhere, never acknowledging what it would take to enact this vision. One of my patrons explained how welfare was discussed growing up in a Republican family. I got this idea that welfare shouldn't be a government thing because it was inefficient, maybe taken advantage of. It should be the place of church communities and non-profits, which around us did to some extent help people out. Like our church community would take offerings for families in it who were struggling, and we semi-regularly donated to help a local Christian homeless shelter. The key detail here for me is the lack of thought for those outside of the Christian community. The worldview that they're taught was that social welfare in its entirety should be removed from government control, but given to churches instead, who would then take care of those in their direct congregation who sought out Christian charities. This is a clear echo for me of a history which connects many of the topics that we've covered so far. The combination of religion, politics, class, and food that is the history of Christian missionary work. Western colonialism was built on the backs of these missions, both official and unofficial, which sought to bring not just Christian ideas, but conversion and re-education, a practice which damaged and in many cases ultimately destroyed native populations' belief systems and cultures. Christian missionary work, as an exercise in conversion rather than pure charity, relies on the idea of other nations and cultures being backwards or lesser than, and feeds into right-wing extremist views around immigration, food, and white nationalism. Everything in this video has been based on gender, Christian evangelism, class divides, and the next part of the puzzle is inevitably race. It's impossible to talk about the far right in America and not talk about racism, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant prejudice. I spoke to Mara about the fact I was planning to talk about both religion and race in this video, and she immediately clocked a key connection between the two, the deep roots of racism within the American evangelical church.
Evangelicalism is all about racism. You know, there's mega churches, and there are white mega churches and black mega churches. But in terms of evangelicalism, there's a book called White Evangelical Racism, and it is all about how evangelicalism within the United States has been built around the ideas of keeping white kids separate from black children. You know, this goes back to around the Board of Education when segregation of schools was starting to be erased, right? So suddenly black children could go to white schools. Well, that's when evangelicals started saying, oh no, you know, the government has to help pay for private schools. And it wasn't that all of a sudden that they became really religious. It's like they didn't want their kids to be in the same school as black kids. And so, you know, we see, you know, over and over and over again, the policies that evangelicals want to implement have everything to do with racism.
One of my patrons sent me their great uncle's letters and other writings about growing up Southern Baptist, and it included one section which explained a similar observation from the point of view of people at the time. The unspoken custom was that since we were white, we would get the better house to stay in, and the races did not mingle socially. Whites were welcome at black churches, but blacks were not to attend white churches, and these customs and many others were enforced, at times forcefully. The far right and these subsections of the church aren't both using food to reinforce the same ideas around gender because of accidental international beliefs. The white supremacist basis of the far right is just as much part of those evangelical churches which preach the superiority of traditional American family values to the sea of white faces. The issues of gender and food within the far right are inherently connected with race too. There are entire books written about the ways that black women's bodies have been politicized, their gender critiqued, and their personhood questioned over the centuries. And this area, food, is no exception. Now, think about the image that the far right sells of white women. An image of a small and delicate body that is natural, either because the body looks that way with no effort, or because she is naturally able to hone her body to be that way. Ideas of racial purity are not simply about someone's circumstances of birth. There is a right way to be white to these groups, and food is a significant part of that right way. In an analysis of one white separatist group's discourses on gender and motherhood, healthy food and a holistic lifestyle key to a racially pure home. This guidance is shared through newsletters or websites with names like Women's Frontier. Organic, raw fruits and vegetables are particularly encouraged, contrasted with the billion-dollar Jew food industry that threatens the health and vitality of white people. In these cases, hate is honed through nutritious food, lovingly prepared by white women for their families. Healthy food is a symbolic stand-in for responsibility, love, intelligence, and more. The idea of having proper food for your family is not just an individual action facilitated by things like time, money, or geography. It's evidence of these white people's moral and biological superiority. They are good people who care about their families. Anyone without the money, time, or even interest in adhering to a strict diet is an evidence of the inherent failings of entire populations. They are lazy, uncaring, mentally inferior even. As Professor Sabrina Strings puts it, to the extent that people are linking indulgence in the oral appetite to an animalistic inability to control oneself, fatness became linked to the racial group judged to lack the capacity for self-government, black people. So-called race science presents itself as a kind of reasonable racism, by co-opting the language of scientific rationality and objectivity to peddle white supremacist ideas. Calling black people animals is obviously overtly racist, but concealing that implication under layers of pseudoscience and claims to authority is just as bad, but much easier to peddle to the masses, using jargon words and claims of genetic difference between races to make claims about the likelihood of a race to be criminal or unintelligent, or foregoing this complexity altogether and relying on out-of-context statistics which imply any racialized differences between groups is innate and biological rather than influenced by social context and systemic experiences, for example. And this connection between food and racism isn't specific to the modern far right. It's something that we see evidence of in everything from the scaremongering around MSG to the various slurs related to culture's cuisines. The patron who sent me their great-uncle's writings also included an anecdote which reveals the importance of food to the social rules of segregation. My great-uncles, my family is white, talk about their experiences with racism.
I understand that.
But one thing that one uncle said really stood out to me. They had a racist aunt who was a staunch segregationist. Her view was that black people could be your family, even raise your children, but when it came to eating meals, they would have to eat in the kitchen while the rest of the white family ate in the dining room. She was an unreconstructed southerner from this start, and believed coloured people had their place, and it was not the same as white ones. They made good workers and were like family members, but they were to keep their place. This meant they could clean house, nurse the sick, tend, and practically raise the children, but at mealtime, their place was at the kitchen table. Conversations were often carried on at mealtime between the kitchen and the dining room. Remember what I said at the start about food being something that can create in and out groups? That's a tactic that far right has jumped on. The universal importance of familiarity, which means racist xenophobic rhetoric can present cultural food variation as evidence of fundamental biological differences between us. Not just that cultures that eat unfamiliar food or use other tools to do so are different, but that they are less. I think that most importantly, food is so foundationally cultural that differences in cuisine become marks not just of foreignness, but specifically for the far right of un-Americanness. And then, predictably, invented cultural crimes can be used to stoke that racialized hatred. Take, for example, the Hope story last year of Haitian immigrants killing and eating American neighborhood pets in Ohio. Not true, fake news as they say, but the story spread. Trump repeated the claims as if they were true, because of course he did, along with other political figures like Vance and Musk, lending them a kind of legitimacy, especially to particular communities. And again, this isn't new. As John Chen persuasively argues, the symbolism of food figures prominently in anti-immigration rhetoric against Chinese people. The American Federation of Labor evoked the cultural connotations of food to argue for the undesirability of Asian immigration. In 1902, Samuel Gompers co-authored a tract calling for Asian exclusion, entitled Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolieism, Which Shall Survive? If someone can have such different ideas around something as simple as food, what other things might they be thinking or doing? That might be how they do it over there in that country, but that isn't how America does things. We don't want them coming over here food. The closest many people to these attitudes when immigrants to their food is serving it to them, or producing the ingredients needed on American farms, including prison farms. As Tradlife content shows us, food production is wholesome and pure when done in aesthetic homestead gardens, but industrialized manual labor, well, that suits black and brown bodies just fine. The irony, of course, is that our idea of a culturally white American foodscape is a homogenized nonsense, often co-opted from other cultures, particularly black enslaved Americans and their descendants. While in New York for work a few years ago, I had time to go to one museum and ended up making, I think honestly, the best decision I could have made by catching a brief temporary exhibit at the Museum of Food and Drink called African American Making the Nation's Table. And it was genuinely one of the best exhibits I've ever seen. As the official description explains, African American contributions to our nation's culinary culture are foundational and ongoing. For over 400 years, African Americans have inspired our nation's food through their skill, creativity, and entrepreneurship. Black foodways have shaped much of what we farm, what we cook, what we drink, and where we eat. Enslaved Africans helped develop our agricultural systems. African American chefs pioneered new ideas in the culinary arts. Black brewers and distillers crafted American spirits using African techniques. Black restaurateurs used commerce to promote activism and create food hubs that united communities. It isn't hard to argue that one of the least historically grounded traditions in America in terms of cultural food is white food. America is a country which has been continually constructing and reconstructing what whiteness is. What might be seen as white American food today was ethnic immigrant food just decades ago. And that shifting sand of culture is much easier to co-opt. It's much easier to cherry pick or even make up a food tradition and claim it as part of white culture as a supposed historical tradition that somehow unites the white race under one strong banner of superior culture. If we want to talk about the history of whiteness and food in America, ultimately we need to talk about the dark origins of American colonialism. The history of colonialism is the history of food. They are inseparable because it combines the cultural assimilation of food practices with the violent tactics of food denial and destruction. Take the prevailing Christian American belief of the 1800s, manifest destiny. The idea that white Christians in America had not just a duty or a right, but a literal God-given destiny to expand westward to conquer the land and claim it as their own. This involved displacing native populations by its very premise. And one of the ways to ensure not just migration, but devastation of these traditional lands was in the extermination of the bison. During the 19th century, colonialists hunted and culled the species almost to extinction, with just a few hundred left alive at one point. Many native populations, which depended on bison hunting for their physical usage of the animal, but also held them in deep cultural regard, the Lakota or Blackfoot people, for example. The widespread death of these creatures was an arrogant show of supposed white supremacy, careless of the impact on those that hunted them for food in a way that preserved their numbers. But it wasn't just the bison that were used in food-based cultural warfare. During the Revolutionary War, American militiamen destroyed tens of thousands of bushels of Cherokee corn in order to starve Cherokee communities into submission. And this continued into the 20th century. In 1914, Hamilton presented Senator Lane's committee with blunt testimony about the American officers' custom of withholding treaty rations from certain Indians in order to starve out political opposition. Hamilton's allegations that McPatridge had starved 149 Blackfeet to death during the previous winter's battles over the surplus unallotted lands provisions raised a public uproar. Although subsequent investigations failed to officially document all of these deaths, a survey of the reservation revealed widespread starvation and malnutrition. The original bad poor in the states was the native population, a poverty which was manufactured and enforced, and then used to claim racial superiority. Colonial policymakers could use the results of their own starvation policies to justify more colonial policy under the guise of benevolent help on reservations. It wasn't just about the separation of cultures, but the destruction of them too. And then this coincides with the concept of religious superism, a name given to the practice during the Great Famine in the mid-1800s in Ireland, for which is a long-standing tool of religious suppression. It refers to the withholding of food. Sure, you can access these food banks or superficial rations if you listen to our sermons, if you give up your food roles, if you agree to convert. It was known in Ireland as superism because of the derogatory name given to Catholics who converted for food, supers, people who had taken the soup of Protestants. How desperate do you need to make a population before they are choosing between their survival and their culture and history? Not through great feasts and luxuries, but through bowls of soup. Perhaps the most effective way to raise culture is ensuring the upcoming generation doesn't have a chance to learn about it at all in the first place, so there's no chance of them passing on to their children as they grow. In addition to military force and the threat of arrest, federal agents also coerced Indian families to give up their children through systematic campaigns of hunger. By withholding the delivery of treaty rations on remote reservations during the winter, for instance, superintendents forced native parents to give up their starving children in the hope that they would at least be able to eat before this. Such was the case on the Hopi Reservation, where federal agents essentially laid siege on the families returned to deliver their children, as well as on the Ojibwe reservations of northern Minnesota, where Banks and many other children were taken. As I worked on this video, the ending became more and more clear to me, increasingly inevitable. I was writing and researching examples of prejudice and dehumanization and starvation being used as political tactics of control. I was unpacking all the ways that food has been used as a weapon. The American far right was the specific area that I decided to focus on, but as I'm sure you've realized by now, they aren't unique. There are so many dystopian but very real examples of those in positions of control using food to exert terrible power over people. In Congo, in Sudan, and in Gaza right now. Starvation is a word that's taken root in many of our minds for a long time now. A harsh and brutal word for a worse reality. Maybe for some of you, it's lost its meaning by now. Lost in the anonymity of statistics or the helplessness of distance. Starvation, the tactic. Starving, the experience. Men starving, women starving, children starving. Families, friends, neighbors, people starving. It takes a long time, but barely any time at all. In a world where billionaires exist, starvation is a deliberate horror, and genocide is enacted just as much in the mill as in the munitions factory. Food is life, it is culture, and it is power. A power that I think many of us underestimate in the face of more overt violence or political aggression. You see food as a personal thing, or a source of everyday fuel, or something that you struggle with mentally even, or a way to bond with your family. Yet this hyper-individualistic concept of food, one which often keeps us removed from the production of what we eat, is also how these insidious ideas about food and race and gender and class and religion can be slipped into our communities. And it's only when we look outwards at the rest of the table, rather than down our own plate, that we might begin to make change. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to join the Patreon community, help support me make these videos into the future, then I will leave a link in the description. I've also left links in the description of some organizations that you might want to check out, maybe support that work in issues of food justice. And until I see you next time, bye.
As a mom of 2 boys, having health insurance is extremely important. I am beyond thankful of having coverage through healthcare.gov. It covers all of our doctor's appointments, including emergency care.
Healthcare.gov. Enroll by December 15th.
Alright. I guess we could get this closer. Find any bit there.
Hello, my name is Emily, as you may or may not know, and today we are going to be talking about influencers that are my worst nightmare. As in influencers that I personally, in my humble opinion, would not want to be. So like, it would be a nightmare for me personally. If you thought that you were gonna click on this video and get some sort of drama or tea where I'm talking about specific influencers that I don't like or something like that, I would be happy to report that that is incorrect. I simply don't care that much about other influencers, and I am also a pacifist. Today it's pretty much going to be casual vibes, kind of just like a yapping video but with sketches. Okay? The internet is a huge place, right? There's so many different avenues to find success, so many different niches to be in, right? Especially with, I mean, influencing being one of the fastest growing industries of recent times. But every job has its downsides, right? Influencing included. And because there's so many different types of influencers, there's so many different types of downsides. And isn't that a beautiful thing to only focus on the negative? So the types of influencers I'm going to be talking about today: couple channels, high budget Mr. Beastified viral YouTubers, gimmick creators, man on the street interviewers, and last but not least, oh, certainly not least, thirst trappers. Thirst. I was gonna try and make a joke about like being parched or something. Maybe it'll come to me later. Ugh, sorry. Do you ever get an itch in the middle of your back and it's kind of like goddamned me to hell, right? So to start off, I know that I've talked about couple channels before in regards to public breakups and pranks, but I have to circle the block. I do have to run it back. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with making couples content, like, at all, so let me get that out of the way, but I do think that when you are a your whole brand is being a couple, right? I think it can be really easy to fall into the lane or avenue of people only liking you guys as a couple and not necessarily as creators, if that makes sense. It's like the only way I think that I could be in a couple channel is if I were to make stuff like my friends Izzy and Emma, right? Think anyone's gonna listen to us if we're acting like this? Bro, why are you arching like that? Where it's like, yes, they are a couple, but at the end of the day, they're funny and they make funny content. And I honestly do think that people would even watch their stuff and think they were funny, even if they were just friends, right? And I don't think a lot of couple channels can say that, maybe. When I think about typical couples content, I'm thinking about things that are, it's like Instagram reel coworker humor. Does that make sense? It's like, not to say that it's bad, it's just not my cup of tea, right?
We're gonna pause this, because I got the DLC for Binding of Isaac, like the newest one. I haven't played this shit since forever. So we're just gonna push that to the side. I want to take it in.
Isaac and his mother lived alone in a small house on a hill.
No way, no. Start off small.
Pretty fly. Explosive. Diarrhea. 48-hour energy.
out of here, but only because I'm probably gonna take a nap. But it was pretty cool. I suck at Isaac.